And before we move to other endgames, let's have another quick look for some important tactical elements in the pawn's endgames. Let's start with very simple. White king is on h1, black king is on h3, and we have 3 pawns. 3 versus 3. a5, b5, c5 versus a7, b7, c7. I guess many of you are aware about this simple trick, so how white can break through without having a king, so simply with 3 pawns, it's b6, and no matter what black does, with after a b6, of course, we'll go c6, b takes c6, and a6. And the same maneuver works if black after b6 take with c pawn, then we just have to make sure that our c pawn, which has an open file, is advancing after a6. So cleaning the path for c pawn. Quick question. If you play black, do you know what to do to stop this breakthrough? Because there's only one move that can prevent it and save you from trouble. It's b6. You have just to stop white b pawn from advancing. And then everything is exchanged. You probably win this pawn, but it will be eventually a draw. And a few other small things. Of course, having passed pawns, connected pawns, is more powerful than having separate pawns. But sometimes things could be different. And for instance, if we have position with our pawns on f6 and h6, and black king is on g8, and black has 3 pawns, they are advancing. a4, b4, c4, and our king standing is on b2. What is the only move for us to survive? Because it will be eventually mutual zugzwang. Black cannot move the king. If king moves, one of our pawns is advancing. So can we stop these pawns? And the right move is you go king b1. And now you're waiting. This is a good position. You know, king is observing. Which pawn moves? a3, we go king a2, c3, king b3. Bingo, pawn stopped. c3, you know, king goes on c2, a3, king b3, the same result. And of course, if black goes b3, then king b2, and pawns are stopped again. The irony is that if white king is on b1, then white is lost. Because if white goes on b2, then b3, and we lost. And if white goes on a2, then c3, and we lost again, since you cannot stop these 3 pawns. As a matter of fact, if we know this trick, how to work with these pawns, I can tell you that there are many other situations where opponent's king can be cut by 2 or 1 or 2 passed pawns. For instance, that's another situation we want to remember. It looks that white pawns are too weak, and they are too weak. If black king was on h8, yes. If there was no pawn on f7, yes. But having this pawn on f7, that's the worst case of interference, because black, again, has no moves. And it depends on whether white can force black pawns to be blocked. So there are many tactical motives that we're always looking at. So you should remember that your king can be blocked. For instance, here is the situation. So this is the king is blocked by this pawn, and so that's why it's advancing. So sometimes pawns could be destructions, because they block your own king from approaching the key side of the battlefield. But I think that's enough. We'll talk a little bit more about it in the case studies. There'll be some very interesting positions that we'll study separately, and we'll taste your knowledge and what you've learned throughout this very quick tour on the pawns endgames. And now we move to a few other endgames. Rook's endgames, probably the most common endgames, happens all the time. And many of these endgames with multiple pawns, they're yet to be determined whether one side is winning or not. We don't want to go too much in analyzing some specific positions. Again, we'll look at some rules, some patterns that is important to remember while playing this rook's endgames. For instance, one of the positions, if you have this knight pawn and you are reaching the 7th rank and your opponent is trying to block you by cutting your king from h file. So how are you going to escape from g8 and advance the pawn? Because after king f7 there's a check. Rook always will check you. So there's the method called the bridge. The bridge on the 4th rank. You put the rook on e4, black waits, and you start bringing your king out. Rook f2 check, king goes on g6, rook g2 check, king goes on f6, rook f2, king g5, rook g2, and rook g4. And that's it. Of course, these endgames have more details to learn, but that's one of the important basic methods. And of course, if you have an h pawn or a pawn, so the rook pawn, then your chances of winning are almost minimal. Then it's the only way to win is if you cut the king even further. So, and then you have the room to go with rook on f8 and g8 and just escaping with the king. There's also very important lesson, and we already had it once in our tactical section. So if we have the pawn, rook in front of the pawn, and the pawn reaches the 7th rank, and black is blocking it from behind, and it's very important that the king, if you are on defensive side, your king is on g7 or h7, because otherwise there is famous maneuver, rook goes on h8, rook a7, and skewer. We already learned it, remember. And also, it's quite important to know that there are other maneuvers. So where would be the best location for the rook? If white pawn is on a6 and king is gradually approaching. So just should remember that the best position of the rook will be on the side. Because when the king is approaching, then you start checking. And you always keep an eye. If pawn goes on a7, you go rook a6. So, and you always have from here, f6 on g6, you always have opportunities to attack the king when it's approaching. So you probably can figure it out that definitely the best position of the rook is behind enemy's pawn. Sometimes on the side, but because by doing so, you're attacking the passed pawn, and also you are limiting the activity of opponent's rook. It works even if you have many pawns here. Let's say you have 3 pawns. Still the same. If your rook is behind enemy's pawn, you can do 2 things. You are limiting the activity of white's rook, but also you're attacking pawns here, and you're preventing king from activating. And then you can start creating some counterplay by f6, g5, so just making sure that white king cannot walk away without losing pawns on that side. Now, imagine that white rook goes on c6, for instance, especially if the pawn is not rook pawn, but knight pawn. Of course, any movement of the pawn to the center makes it more difficult. So because b pawn will be better for white, c pawn, c pawn is probably as good, because it's what's important that here you have more chances of activating the king, even sacrificing some pawns and reaching out. But the ideal, of course, will be to put rook behind your pawn. And that's, for instance, that would be a position similar to what's happened in the last game of famous match in 1927 at Lechia Capablanca. Having your rook behind your passed pawn guarantees that this pawn can move on, and if black blocks this pawn, then the rook is is paralyzed, and then you simply bring the king. So it's a general rule, but it's easy to explain because you just have to make sure that your pieces are most active. And having your rook, if you are on the weak side, on the defensive side, behind the pawn, enemy's passed pawn, always helps. Same rule works for multiple pawns endgames. You have passed pawns, protected pawns, whatever. So every time you should remember that active rook in the endgame offers you a good opportunity, a good chance to either save the game or, if you are on the strong side, to win the game. There's an important modification of the pawn's endgames, you may call it, a queen versus pawn. Sometimes it happens. You promote first, but then there's one pawn on the second rank or the seventh rank, and it's important to remember that there are certain rules. So if we have a queen somewhere, our king is somewhere, and black has a king and a pawn. So pawn on d2, it's easy. So I'm sure you know how to win. You pin it, you give a check, you force the king here, and then you make sure a king goes in front of the pawn, and then you start bringing your king. No matter how far is the king, you can always have the same maneuver. That works if the pawn is on b2, the knight pawn. Same rule, same maneuver. The trick is what happens if we have rook pawn or bishop pawn. So with rook pawn, it's really tough because if you do the same thing, then king goes on a1 and it's a stalemate. And if your king is far away, you cannot win. The only way to win against this pawn, if your king is relatively close, that's important to remember, say on d5. And then you give a check, b1, and now you rush with your king. Back, black promotes a queen, but after king b3, simple but quite attractive. Two queens, but you can see the difference. This queen has no real value, so it doesn't help. It cannot prevent black from being mated. Even more interesting when we have bishop's pawn. Here is the same problem. If our king is far away, and we just do the same, and giving the check on b3 here, eventually, black king goes not on c1, but on a1, and taking the pawn. It's a draw, it's a stalemate. So the same problem. So ideally, we need to make sure that our king is close enough, so to reach position like this one, then we can go back with a king b4, c1, queen, and king b3. Trick is that it's not that simple because, for instance, in such a position with king on b2, black could be also quite smart and not going king b1, but going king a1. So we'll learn a little bit more in one of the case studies, because I think it's quite important that you know all these tricks, since having the c pawn, having the knight pawn is quite an important practical knowledge. It happens. This is not a position that is highly theoretical. So recognizing all these patterns, recognizing all the motifs with queen versus pawn, especially with the bishop pawn, it's quite important. So we'll move on with our case study. What really makes a great deal of difference between the end game and the middle game or the opening, a really great deal of difference, is the role of the king. Of course, king can be mated. Even in the end game, you can be mated. We saw already like a couple of pawns can trap the king in the corner. But those are exceptions. The general rule is the king is the king. It plays vital role in most of the end games. And activating the king, bringing king to the center, it's sometimes, or actually quite often, is the main ingredient of your success. whether you have to win the game or save the game, make sure that the king is centralized, that's what we say. So centralizing the king, bringing the king in the game will give you an extra piece because king is quite powerful. If queens are out, most of the pieces are out of the board, king could feel safe and could do a lot of damage for opponents by being active and by moving from one side to another. It takes time, of course, for king to travel from a1 to h8. It's not the bishop that it just takes one move, but it can actually go there. So just remember that activating the king is very important.